At 7:14 p.m., the sky over Oakhaven didn't just turn dark, it turned violently white. The birds fell first, calcified mid-flight. When the air itself caught fire, a 58-year-old widow made a split-second decision that defied human instinct. She didn't run. She crawled straight down into the earth. Martha Higgins lived at the end of a long, dust-choked dirt road in Oakhaven, Nebraska. At 58, she was a woman carved from the harsh prairie winds, pragmatic, fiercely independent, and profoundly tired. It had been 3 years since her husband, Arthur, passed away. Arthur had been a structural engineer for the county, but in his later years, a dark obsession had taken root in his mind. He became convinced that the world was teetering on the edge of an environmental collapse. Not a slow warming, but a sudden, catastrophic atmospheric shift. Martha had spent the last years of his life watching him pour their savings into what she called his monuments to paranoia. The most glaring of these was the well. It sat 50 yards from their back porch. It wasn't a traditional water well. The water table here was too deep, and the town relied on a municipal line anyway. Instead, Arthur had excavated a 40-foot deep, reinforced cylindrical shaft. He lined it with high-grade corrugated steel and poured concrete, installing heavy iron rungs directly into the wall. At the bottom was a small 10-by-10 subterranean chamber outfitted with ventilation pipes that he never quite finished wiring. He called it an atmospheric bunker. He died of a massive coronary right beside it on a Tuesday morning, a rusted wrench still gripped in his hand. For 3 years, Martha left the well exactly as it was. She locked the heavy sliding steel plate that covered the opening and threw the key in her kitchen drawer. It was a morbid tombstone for a man she loved but had stopped understanding. Her neighbor, Silas Gable, a bitter old rancher who owned the adjacent property, frequently complained about the corrugated ventilation pipes sticking out of the ground, calling them an eyesore that ruined his view of the pasture. Martha ignored him. She found a strange comfort in leaving Arthur's final project undisturbed. The day everything changed was July 14th. It was an unseasonably hot Tuesday. The thermometer nailed to the wooden post of Martha's front porch read 98 degrees by noon, but it wasn't the heat that felt wrong. It was the absolute, suffocating stillness. Anyone who lives in the country knows that silence is never truly silent. There is always the hum of cicadas, the rustle of dry grass, the distant drone of a crop duster, or the barking of dogs. But by 4 p.m., Oakhaven went completely, terrifyingly quiet. Martha was sitting at her kitchen table, snapping green beans into a porcelain bowl, when she noticed the silence. Her golden retriever, Barnaby, had been whining at the back door for an hour. When she finally let him out, he didn't run to the fence to bark at Silas's cattle like he usually did. Instead, he slunk under the porch, pressing his belly flat against the cool dirt, whimpering. Martha turned on her old transistor radio, hoping to catch the local weather report on KRUZ 104.5. Tom Hennessy, the local DJ, whose voice had been a fixture in Oakhaven for 2 decades, sounded tense. "Folks, we're getting some strange readings down at the station. The barometer is dropping faster than I've ever seen. We've got reports from the county sheriff that car engines are stalling out on Route 9. Stay indoors. Keep your windows shut. The sky is looking, well, I don't know how to describe it." Martha stood up and walked to the kitchen window. She dropped the handful of green beans. They scattered across the linoleum floor. The sky was no longer blue. It was bruised. A deep, sickly violet was bleeding across the horizon, swirling with veins of neon cyan. It looked like a massive, unnatural aurora borealis, but it was thick, heavy, and descending rapidly. She stepped out onto the back porch. The air was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like she was deep underwater. Her ears popped painfully. She took a breath, and her lungs protested. The air smelled foul, a sharp, metallic scent, like burnt copper and ozone. Then, she saw Silas Gable's cattle. Through the wire fence separating their properties, she saw a dozen massive Angus cows standing perfectly still. As she watched, one of them simply tipped over. It didn't struggle. It didn't bellow. It just collapsed like a felled tree. Then another. And another. "Silas!" Martha yelled, stepping off the porch. Before she could take another step, a crow fell out of the oak tree above her. It hit the dry grass with a dull thud. Martha stared at it in horror. Its feathers weren't ruffled. Its eyes were open, crystallized and white. The atmosphere was compressing. A deep, low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the soles of her boots. It was a sound you didn't just hear. You felt it in your teeth. The air temperature began to spike unnaturally fast. In the span of 30 seconds, a sheen of sweat broke out across Martha's forehead. The 9-8-degree heat skyrocketed. The wooden railing of her porch began to warp and pop in the sudden, baking intensity. Something is burning the air, she realized. A cold spike of pure terror piercing through her confusion. Arthur's paranoid ramblings echoed in her mind. The atmosphere is a fragile bubble, Martha. If the magnetic field tears, even for a second, the solar wind will bake the surface in an instant. Whether it was a solar flare, a freak geological venting, or a ruptured atmospheric pocket, the why didn't matter anymore. The surface of the earth was becoming uninhabitable. The radio inside the house crackled, and Tom Hennessy's voice screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure agony before the broadcast cut into dead, hissing static. The violet sky suddenly ignited into a blinding, incandescent white. The heat hit like a physical wall. The paint on Martha's wooden siding instantly blistered and began to peel. The grass at her feet turned brown, then black, curling into ash right before her eyes. Barnaby, hidden beneath the porch, let out one sharp yelp, and then nothing. "No," Martha gasped, throwing her hands over her face as the skin on her forearms began to sear. She spun around, intending to run back into the house. But as she looked through the kitchen window, the curtains burst into flames. The ambient temperature was crossing the ignition point of dry fabric. The house was a death trap. Her storm cellar was no better. It had a slatted wooden door that would burn through in minutes, and the spring rains had left 3 feet of stagnant water down there anyway. There was only one place. The well. Martha ran. It was only 50 yards, but pushing through the superheated air was like trying to run through boiling water. Her throat scorched with every ragged breath. Her clothes grew hot against her skin. She reached the concrete lip of the well. The heavy steel plate was padlocked. The key. It was in the kitchen drawer. The kitchen that was currently filling with thick, black smoke. A primal scream tore from her throat. She looked around frantically. Lying near the perimeter fence was a heavy, iron crowbar Arthur had used for leverage when pouring the concrete. She lunged for it, the metal burning her palms as she picked it up. She ran back to the steel plate, wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the heavy padlock hinge, and threw her entire body weight against it. 58 years of farm labor, of hauling feed and wrestling with rusted machinery, concentrated into one desperate surge of adrenaline. The metal shrieked. The screws in the concrete groaned. With a violent crack, the hinge snapped off, sending Martha tumbling backward into the scorching dirt. The sky was roaring now. It sounded like a dozen freight trains rushing overhead. The white light was so intense it bleached the color from the world. Martha scrambled to her feet, grabbed the steel handle of the sliding cover, and hauled it back. The heavy plate rolled on its rusted tracks with a deafening screech, revealing the pitch-black, 40-foot abyss below. A wave of cool, stale air drifted up from the darkness. It was salvation. She swung her legs over the edge, her boots finding the first iron rung. She didn't look down. She just started climbing. 10 feet, 20 feet. The rungs were cool beneath her blistered hands. Above her, the circle of blinding white light looked like the mouth of hell. She could hear the wooden frame of her farmhouse collapsing, the roar of the firestorm consuming everything she had ever owned. 30 feet. 40. Her boots hit the concrete floor of the small chamber. It was pitch black. The air was thin, smelling faintly of old cement and damp earth, but it was breathable. It was cold. She collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving, tears tracking through the soot on her face. She had made it. She was alive. "Please don't move." Martha froze. The voice was tiny, shaking. It came from the darkest corner of the 10-by-10 bunker. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She patted the ground frantically, searching for the emergency flashlight Arthur used to keep hanging on a hook near the bottom rungs. Her fingers brushed the heavy plastic casing. She clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. Huddled in the corner, clutching a rusty pipe as a weapon, was Elena Jenkins. Elena was a 24-year-old single mother who lived in a dilapidated trailer about a mile down the road. She used to clean Martha's house twice a month to make ends meet. Tucked behind Elena's legs, burying his face in his mother's skirt, was her 6-year-old son, Toby. Elena dropped the pipe, squinting against the flashlight's glare. She was pale, her face streaked with dirt and terror. "Mrs. Higgins? Oh my God. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Elena?" Martha breathed, utterly bewildered. How did you get down here?" "I was driving home from the diner," Elena sobbed, pulling Toby tighter against her. "The radio went crazy. The sky started turning purple. My car just died. The engine just completely died in front of your property. I felt the heat. I knew my trailer wouldn't hold up. I remembered you telling me about Arthur's crazy bunker once while we were having coffee. The lock on the gate was old. I smashed it with a rock. I didn't think you were home. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Martha lowered the flashlight. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, calculating reality. Elena and Toby were alive because of a desperate gamble, but they were all in terrible danger. Martha looked up. The circle of light 40 feet above them was no longer white. It was a churning, violent orange. A waterfall of sparks and burning ash was beginning to rain down the shaft. The cover. In her frantic descent, Martha hadn't closed the heavy steel plate. She had left it wide open. If the firestorm above intensified, the ambient heat would funnel straight down the concrete tube, turning their sanctuary into a 40-foot oven. "We're not safe," Martha said, her voice terrifyingly calm. Elena looked up at the fiery hole, her eyes widening. "We have to close it." "There's a lever," Martha said, remembering Arthur's blueprints. He installed a chain pulley system on the inside of the shaft, about 5 feet down from the surface. You just pull the chain, and the door rolls shut and locks. But you have to climb back up to reach it. Elena looked at her 6-year-old son. She looked at the iron rungs leading back up into the inferno. She began to hyperventilate. "I can't. I'll leave him down here. I'll go." "You stay with your boy," Martha interrupted sharply, already grabbing the bottom rung. "You're young. If I don't make it, somebody has to be here to take care of him." "Mrs. Higgins, no, you'll burn." "Arthur built this damn thing," Martha growled, hauling herself up the first 10 feet. "I'm going to make sure it works." The climb was agonizing. As Martha ascended past 20 feet, the temperature spiked dramatically. The air grew thinner, searing her throat. The iron rungs, which had been cool at the bottom, were growing increasingly hot. 30 feet. The skin on her knuckles began to crack and bleed. The roaring above was deafening, a chaotic symphony of snapping timber, howling wind, and the relentless sizzle of a burning world. 35 feet. She was 5 feet from the surface. The heat was unbearable. It felt as though her clothes were about to combust. She looked around frantically. Bolted to the concrete wall to her right was a rusted iron wheel with a heavy, thick chain dangling from it. "Hold the chain." Martha reached out with her right hand, her fingers wrapping around the metal. It was blisteringly hot. She screamed through her teeth, her grip tightening despite the agonizing pain, and threw her weight backward. The mechanism groaned. Years of rust and neglect fought against her. "Come on, Arthur," she rasped, tears instantly vaporizing off her cheeks. "Don't fail me now." She jerked the chain again with every ounce of strength she had left. Something in the pulley gave way with a loud clack. Above her, the massive steel plate began to slide along its tracks. It moved slowly, excruciatingly slowly, as a torrent of superheated wind funneled down into the shaft, catching Martha's hair and singing the ends. The gap narrowed. A foot, 6 inches, with a final, echoing boom. The steel plate slammed shut. The lock clicked into place. The violent roar of the burning world was instantly muffled to a low, distant rumble. The blinding orange light vanished, plunging the shaft into absolute, suffocating darkness. Martha clung to the rungs. Her hands burned, her chest heaving, suspended 40 feet above the floor in pitch blackness. She had sealed them in. They were safe from the fire. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, terrifying sound reached her ears in the darkness. It wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the floor of the bunker below. It was the sound of a heavy, metallic hiss. A pressurized gas leak. Martha clung to the iron rungs, suspended in absolute darkness. The silence of the sealed shaft was heavy, pressing against her eardrums, but it was shattered by that sound, a sharp, mechanical hiss, violently venting into the enclosed space of the bunker below. "Mrs. Higgins?" Elena's voice wavered, echoing up the concrete cylinder. "What is that? I can't breathe. The air smells sharp." Martha's forearms trembled. Her hands, badly blistered from the superheated chain, screamed with agony as she gripped the rungs. "Turn on the flashlight," Elena pointed at the far wall. A beam of yellow light sliced through the pitch black, illuminating the dusty concrete floor and sweeping over to a corner Martha had never fully inspected. There, bolted to the wall behind a rusted wire mesh, stood a cluster of 3 industrial-sized green steel cylinders, Arthur's auxiliary oxygen tanks. The firestorm above had violently sucked the oxygen from the surface, creating an extreme pressure differential that traveled down the uncapped ventilation pipes before Martha had sealed the hatch. The sudden vacuum had ruptured a brittle rubber O-ring on the primary manifold. Oxygen was bleeding out. Fast. In a sealed 10 by 10 subterranean box, a pure oxygen leak wasn't just a waste of their only clean air supply. If a spark from the flashlight or a static shock ignited it, the bunker would become a bomb. "It's the air reserve," Martha shouted, descending the ladder as fast as her injured hands would allow. She dropped the last 5 feet, landing hard on her knees. The smell of concentrated, metallic gas was overwhelming. Toby was coughing, burying his face in Elena's neck. "We have to shut off the main valve," Martha said, scrambling to her feet and snatching the flashlight from Elena. She aimed it at the top of the tanks. There was a heavy brass wheel, but the pressure valve beside it was completely blown out. "The primary is gone. We need to clamp the manifold line itself." Martha looked around frantically. Her beam caught Arthur's old metal workbench. A heavy steel pipe wrench lay beside a disorganized pile of bolts. "Grab that wrench," Martha ordered, shining the light on it. "Me?" Elena stammered, paralyzed by the hissing sound and the claustrophobia of the bunker. "I don't know how. My hands are burned, Elena," Martha snapped, holding up her palms. The skin was peeling, raw and bleeding. "I can't grip the iron. You have to do it, or we are going to die down here. Now grab the wrench." The raw authority in Martha's voice broke through Elena's panic. The young mother set Toby down gently. "Cover your ears, baby," she whispered, then lunged for the workbench. The pipe wrench was heavy, slick with old grease. "Bring it here," Martha instructed, stepping back to shine the beam directly on the ruptured steel pipe connecting the cylinders. "Fit the jaws over the hex nut beneath the blowout. You're going to have to turn it clockwise. It's going to fight you. You have to strip the threads to seal it." Elena lifted the heavy tool, her hands shaking violently. She clamped it onto the nut. The hissing was deafening up close, blowing her hair back. "Turn," Martha yelled. Elena threw her weight against the handle. "It didn't budge. It's rusted," she cried out. "You carried a 50-pound bag of dog food up my porch steps last month. Elena, don't tell me you can't turn a damn bolt. Push." Elena gritted her teeth, tears streaming down her face. She adjusted her footing, planting her boots against the concrete wall for leverage, and pushed. A loud screech of metal echoed in the bunker. The nut turned a quarter inch. The hissing decreased slightly. "Again," Martha demanded. Elena heaved again. Screech, another quarter turn. The hiss became a low whistle. "One more. Put everything into it." With a guttural scream, Elena threw her entire body weight onto the wrench handle. The metal groaned, the threads stripped, and with a final heavy clack, the valve crushed inward, sealing off the line. The hissing stopped. The sudden silence in the bunker was deafening. Elena dropped the wrench, collapsing back onto the cold floor next to Toby, sobbing uncontrollably. Martha slumped against the cold steel of the oxygen tanks, sliding down until she was sitting on the concrete. She clicked off the flashlight to save the battery. They sat in the pitch black, the only sound, the ragged, synchronized breathing of 3 survivors buried 40 feet beneath a burning world. Time lost its meaning in the dark. Without the sun, without a clock, Martha could only track the passage of time by the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the frequency of Toby's whimpers. She estimated it had been 3 days. Arthur's paranoia had saved them. Beneath a loose floorboard in the corner, Martha had discovered 2 heavy plastic drums of purified water and a crate of military surplus MREs. It was enough to keep the 3 of them alive for a month, but they didn't have a month. The air was growing stale, heavy with the carbon dioxide they exhaled. The remaining oxygen tanks were functional, but Martha didn't dare bleed them into the room until they absolutely had to. They had spent the hours talking. Martha learned about Elena's struggles, the father who walked out on Toby, the desperate dream of moving out of Oakhaven. Elena learned about Arthur's descent into obsession and how Martha had resented him for building the very tomb that was now keeping them alive. In the absolute dark, stripped of society and status, the widow and the cleaning girl became family. On what Martha guessed was the fourth day, a faint, rhythmic clicking broke the silence. Martha clicked on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the workbench. Beneath a tarp, sitting next to a pile of rusted gears, was an old, heavy-duty shortwave ham radio hooked up to a hand-crank generator. Arthur had never mentioned it. "Elena," Martha whispered, her voice raspy, "crank that handle." Elena scrambled over, grabbing the handle of the generator and turning it furiously. The radio dial flickered to life, glowing with a faint amber light. Martha leaned in, her bandaged hands clumsily twisting the frequency dial. Static hissed through the small speaker. She turned it slower, more static. Then, a voice. "Repeat. This is Commander William Hayes of the National Guard, broadcasting from the Cheyenne Mountain Directorate on emergency frequency 8.9 MHz. If you are receiving this signal, remain in your shelters. The atmospheric ignition event has concluded. Surface temperatures are dropping. Do not attempt to consume surface water. Rescue and assessment teams are deploying from Sector 4. Elena stopped cranking. She looked at Martha, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. "It's over." Martha stared at the amber dial. "The fire is out. But we still have to get out of this hole." They walked to the base of the shaft and looked up. 40 feet above, the heavy steel plate sealed them in. "When I closed it," Martha said slowly, "the pulley broke. It locked from the inside, but the chain snapped." "So how do we open it?" Elena asked. Martha shined the light on the iron rungs. Arthur always had a backup plan. He didn't trust machines. If the pulley failed, there had to be a manual release up there. But it's a heavy plate. I don't have the strength in my hands to lift it. "I'll go," Elena said. There was no hesitation this time. The terrified girl who had cowered in the corner 4 days ago was gone, replaced by a mother desperate to see the sky. "Take the flashlight," Martha said, handing it over. "Look for a secondary lever near the track." Elena tucked the flashlight into her waistband and began to climb. She moved quickly, her boots echoing against the concrete. Martha and Toby watched from below as the small beam of light ascended the dark cylinder. "I'm at the top," Elena's voice echoed down. "Look for the latch," Martha yelled. A moment of silence. "I see it. It's a heavy deadbolt on a track. I'm sliding it back." A loud metallic clank echoed down the shaft. "It's unlocked." "But Mrs. Higgins, it's heavy. There's nothing to grip to push it open." Martha closed her eyes, visualizing the heavy steel plate. "Put your back against the rung. Place your feet flat against the underside of the door, and push like hell." Above, Elena positioned herself in the confined space. She braced her shoulders against the iron ladder, raised her boots to the cool steel above her, and pushed with her legs. A terrible scraping sound echoed as the metal resisted. "It won't move," Elena cried. "There's too much debris on top of it." Martha's heart sank. If the collapsing farmhouse had buried the well, they were dead. "Try again." "Elena, you have to break the seal." Elena let out a scream of pure exertion, her legs trembling violently as she pushed against the ceiling of their world. Suddenly, a sliver of gray light pierced the darkness. Dust and fine white particles drifted down through the crack. With one final, agonizing shove, Elena pushed the plate back just enough to slip through. A rush of freezing air plummeted into the shaft. It didn't smell like pine needles or dry Nebraska dirt anymore. It smelled like wet charcoal and sulfur. "I'm out," Elena yelled. "I'm pushing it open." The sound of metal dragging over rocks echoed above, and the gray light expanded into a half moon. Elena peered down over the edge, her face illuminated by the strange, muted daylight. "Come on up." Martha picked up Toby, hoisting the boy onto the first few rungs. "Climb, sweetheart. Your mom is right there." As Toby scrambled up, Martha followed, favoring her burned hands, climbing slowly toward the surface. When she reached the top, Elena grabbed her under the arms and hauled her up over the concrete lip. Martha collapsed onto her hands and knees. She slowly raised her head to look at Oakhaven. She couldn't breathe. Her two-story farmhouse was gone. In its place was a blackened, smoking crater filled with charred foundation stones. The giant oak tree that had shaded her porch for 30 years was a twisted, carbonized skeleton. Silas Gable's sprawling pastures were a wasteland of gray, pulverized ash. The sky was no longer violet or white. It was a dense, suffocating blanket of gray clouds, blocking out the sun entirely. Everything above ground had died. The world was a monochrome cemetery of ash. Toby buried his face in his mother's jacket, crying softly. Elena stared out at the ruins, her hand covering her mouth. Martha slowly stood up. The wind was bitter cold, cutting right through her thin clothes. She looked back down at the open well. Arthur's monument to paranoia. He had been right. About all of it, and his madness had bought them their lives. "Mrs. Higgins," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do now? Where do we go?" Martha looked at the young woman, then out across the desolate plains where the town of Oakhaven used to be. Somewhere out there, Commander Hayes and the National Guard were moving through the ash. They weren't dead. They were just at the beginning. Martha tightened her jaw, brushing a layer of soot from her ruined coat. "We start walking," Martha said, "taking the first step into the ashes of the new world." If this story of survival, quick thinking, and human resilience kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a gritty, post-apocalyptic thriller, and hit subscribe for more intense, dramatic stories. Drop a comment below. What would you do if the sky suddenly turned white? See you in the next one.